The British victory at Dettingen in June 1743 pushed the Franco-Bavarian troops back from Frankfurt. Although King George II could not follow up this victory and press forward, they were forced to fall back and retreat. King George returned to Britain in November 1743. Though the streets of London celebrated the victory at Dettingen, as the news of the Pragmatic Army being stalled out in Bavaria, the opposition newspaper, The Craftsman, began to launch an attack against the king and the newly appointed Prime Minister, Henry Pelham. The opposition writers in London began to question why Englishmen should be forced to protect the Hanoverian electorate. The opposition even used King George's attire of a yellow Hanoverian sash worn at the Battle of Dettingen as proof of where his loyalties lay. It was here we see King George and the Hanover dynasty being pitted against the British. It is here we see the interest of the Hanoverian dynasty to protect their electorate being pitted against the interest of the British people, not to die in foreign wars. The victory at Dettingen also alarmed Frederick, as this could free the Habsburg army to strike against Prussian-held Silesia. And more concerning for Frederick was the possibility of Saxony changing sides in the conflict. And the King of Prussia also must have known that he was partly to blame for this fiasco. Frederick had insulted his Saxon allies, telling anyone who would listen that they were cowards and cretins. Augustus III, who was the king of held the electorate of Saxony and was also the king of Poland. With this action, it can now allow Russia to join the fight, now that Poland would also be pitted against Frederick. During the fall of 1743, Frederick was encouraging a united Germanic alliance to drive out the Pragmatic Army, but to no avail. On December 20th, 1743, Count Bruhl, who was the chief minister and the true power behind Augustus III of Saxony, could now reconcile with Maria Theresa, who was now determined to push Frederick out of Silesia for good. Frederick was of course not the only monarch who was concerned about the Saxon betrayal. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles Albert of Bavaria saw the Saxon betrayal and the February treaty with Sardinia as a plot to remove him from his position as the Holy Roman Emperor. Negotiations now began for a counter-alliance. An alliance was signed between Prussia, France, Bavaria, Sweden, and the electorates of Hesse-Kassel and the Palatinate. This alliance was known as the League of Frankfurt. Frederick now planned to take the city of Prague quickly. Then, with the Habsburg army occupied with France, Frederick would then be able to make a march to the heart of the Habsburg capital of Vienna. Frederick left Berlin on August 15, 1744. With his two oldest brothers, Augustus William and Henry, with little pushback. The Prussians then moved south into Bohemia and took the cities of Tabor and Budwils in the 2 following weeks. But problems came in when Frederick had assumed the French army at the Rhine would keep the Austrians occupied. The Franco-Bavarian army failed to do so, and hunger began to set in on Frederick's troops. This allowed Prince Charles of Lorraine and his troops to march back to Bohemia with a larger group of Saxon forces. Maria Theresa, eager to push Frederick out, urged Charles to attack the Prussians, but Charles of Lorraine urged caution and hoped to let the weather do the work for them. And so it did. Hunger and famine began to set in the Prussian camp in the winter of 1744. desertion became a major problem, with numbers that even shocked the Habsburgs. Around 15,000 Prussian troops deserted the Prussian camp. The campaign was beginning to go terribly wrong. As Count Ludwig Wilhelm von Monschu would say, "We no longer have an army. What we have is a bunch of men held together by habit and the authority of their officers. And even these officers are discontent, many of them in desperate condition. All we need is the slightest for there to be a mutiny." This forced Frederick to return back to Berlin in complete disappointment. The fall campaign had been a massive disappointment for Frederick and the Prussian army. This also allowed the Habsburgs to retake a large part of Silesia. Frederick would later say of his fall campaign of 1744 that Bohemia is the most difficult nation to make war upon due to its geography. On January 8th, the Quadruple Alliance was forming, joining the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, Austria, and Saxony. But, as fate would have it, on January 20th, Charles Albert, the Holy Roman Emperor, died. And his son and heir, Maximilian III, Joseph, that is, his stupid name, did not have the willpower of his father and did not aspire to be the Holy Roman Emperor. He ordered negotiations with Maria Theresa soon after, leading to the Peace of Fusion signed between Austria and Bavaria on April 22nd. This stipulated that Maximilian III would support the election of Maria Theresa's husband Francis I of Lorraine to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. In the spring of 1745, Frederick found himself in a bit of trouble. The Habsburgs now occupied parts of Silesia. Prussia's former allies, France and Bavaria, now played little role in checking the Habsburgs in Germany, and they had little interest in protecting Frederick. Though France stayed in the conflict, most of their fighting now occurred around the Dutch Republic. Frederick had lost nearly 15,000 men without having a battle during his failed campaign in the late fall and winter of 1744. But it was at this point that Frederick showed his true military and political genius. Frederick left Berlin on March 15th, reaching Breslau, the capital of Silesia, on the 17th, and Nice a week later. At Nice, Frederick set about recruiting more and more troops, even allowing back deserters from the previous campaign. During the month of April, Frederick spent a great deal of time rebuilding the army's morale, and his presence among the troops certainly helped his cause. His charisma was apparent to all the troops who served with him. On April 27th, Frederick wrote to his minister Podwils, "I have made it a question of my personal honor to contribute more to the aggrandizement of my house than any of my predecessors. So far, I have played a distinguished role among the proud heads of Europe. This has become a personal obligation for me, and I am determined to uphold it, even at the cost of my happiness and my life. I have crossed the Rubicon, and now I either want to maintain my position of power, or to see everything perish and be buried with me right down to the very name of Prussia." On May 29th, the Habsburgs joined a group of Saxon forces. The Austrians pursued Frederick, which was exactly what he wanted. He also let it be told, through a double agent in the Austrian camp, that he had planned to retreat to Breslau, where he planned to make his last stand. But this was not his plan at all. Frederick, now having the intelligence advantage, knew the Austrians intended to feint into Upper Silesia and force Frederick to divide his forces. But Frederick declined to be diverted by the Habsburg trap. The Austrians had no clue the size and streaks of Frederick's army, believing they were facing around 40,000 depleted Prussian troops. But, in reality, they were facing around 60,000 Prussians who were eager for action. As the historian Carlyle writes, he had left the mousetrap open, and latterly had been baiting it with a pleasant spicing of toasted cheese. On the night of June 3rd, the Habsburg military leader Charles Alexander set up a camp outside Hohenfriedberg. Frederick told his friend Chassaut, "Now I've got what I wanted. I have just seen the enemy's army leave the hills and spread the plain. Tomorrow will be an important day for me." He sent his army to make a night march, a tactic which was unheard of at this time. At Hohenfriedberg, the Prussian forces numbered around 60,000, and the Habsburg-Saxon coalition forces numbered around 70,000. The Prussian right flank and cavalry were commanded by General de Molin, and he soon made an attack on the Austrian left flank. The Austrians were caught off guard, and their formations lacked coordination. The Prussians were also helped by a large amount of artillery firepower, which pushed the Austrians back on the right flank. This was a strategic victory on Frederick's part, for he placed his artillery firepower on this part of the battlefield. This allowed the Prussians to gain an advantage in the center, where they forced the Saxon infantry to retreat. The Prussian right wing then joined the center to force the Austrians back, though they did not have the same luck on the left side of the Prussian lines. A bridge had collapsed, which slowed them down. But they would soon be helped by the left infantry, which led to the final breakthrough in the Austro-Saxon Saxon lines, where Frederick's cavalry broke through the Austrian center. The dragoons in Frederick's army marched through the Austrian camp, suffering only 100 losses and capturing nearly 2,000 Austrian forces. This forced the Habsburg-Saxon forces to retreat, and Frederick had achieved a great victory. The Prussian casualties numbered only around 5,000, whereas the Austrian casualties numbered around 15,000. The Battle of Hohenfriedberg will go down as one of Frederick's greatest victories, and one of the greatest victories in German history. After his victory at Hohenfriedberg, Frederick eagerly messaged his ally, the King of France, Louis XV, of his victory, as well as messaging his tutor in all military matters, the old Soor, Leopold I. He boasted that the victory at Hohenfriedberg had been one of the most complete of all times, the likes of which had not been seen since Blenheim. Though Maria Theresa was not impressed with the Prussian king, or at least not as impressed as she should have been, forced King George II to make a deal with Frederick and remove himself from the European war, at least in Germany. George urged the Habsburgs to make peace as well with Frederick. And Frederick even said that he would be willing not to vote against Francis I as the Holy Roman Emperor. But now the conflict was purely about Silesia, and Maria Theresa was sure that Frederick had to be defeated. On September 13th, Francis I was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. This only stiffened the Habsburg resolve to take back their lost land in Silesia. Frederick continued to move south as the Habsburgs delayed to make any peace offerings. Frederick had now made it back into Bohemia. The Prussian military crushed the Hungarian hussars behind their lines in Silesia, though now extending their communication lines moved further north into Bohemia. In the very early morning of September 30th, 1745, Charles of Lorraine led a group of Austrian and Saxon forces Charles was now convinced this was the time to strike, considering he had a numerical advantage of around 17,000 more men than Frederick. He also had a geographical advantage, using the mountain passes to his advantage, or at least he was hoping to. The Habsburg coalition forces surprised the Prussians by attacking around 5 a.m. Charles placed his artillery in the Grenadier Cope above the Prussian forces. Frederick, half awake, received the news of the Austrian attack on his position. But this is where all the drilling and discipline of the Prussian army came to their advantage. As they were surprised by the attack, they showed remarkable pace to take their positions and defend their ground. The Prussian cavalry especially fought well, considering they were under a hail of artillery fire, and they were able to push back the Austrian cavalry into the forest. The Austrians had a bit more success in the center of the battlefield, where they defeated the first line of Prussian defenders. The reserve attack, though, in the second line, had much more success. The Prussian right flank were given orders to hold their ground, but despite this, they were prodded into a fight with the Austrians. The Prussians were led by Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick. But surprisingly, the Austrian cavalry showed a lack of initiative and were not able to get involved in the fight. The Prussians were eventually able to envelop the Austrian infantry in the center and then push them back on the right. And despite having a numerical and geographical advantage, the Battle of Soor, as it came to be known, was a major defeat for the Austrian military, who were now forced to retreat behind their lines back into the woods. Although in the heat of battle, a small group of Hungarian hussars were able to sack the Prussian camps and steal a large amount of possessions, even Frederick's flute and pet dog. Also during the battle, Frederick's brother-in-law, Duke Albrecht of Brunswick, died, and telling of his relationship with his wife, didn't even bother to write her. Despite a massive loss at Soor, they were still not obliged to negotiate with Frederick. Frederick now retreated back into Silesia. Then Frederick was able to cut off the Saxons from rejoining Prince Charles and the Austrian army, easily destroying a small group of Saxons on November 23rd. This sent Prince Charles back to Austria. The only problem now was the northern Saxon army, but his old advisor and commander, the old Soor Leopold, at command, with Frederick located to his south, he defeated the outnumbered Saxon forces at Kesselsdorf on December 15th. And on Christmas Day, 1745, the Peace of Dresden was signed, which gave Frederick full control of Silesia. The only thing the Habsburgs had gained from their battles with Frederick would be the agree to recognize Francis as the Holy Roman Emperor, which held little value. The Prussian participation in the War of Austrian Succession was now over. Frederick returned to his capital on December 28, 1745, and for the first time in public, he was hailed as Frederick the Great. This nickname is partially due to his friend Voltaire, who recommended his title be the Great after the Treaty of Berlin in 1742. At the parade in Berlin, a group of schoolchildren sang songs about Frederick's greatness. The urban burghers and traders erected an arch which said, "Frederick the Invincible." Different types of media and slogans, all proclaiming the words, "Long live Frederick the Great."
The deal we gotten for a king, but a wee bit German lairdy. When we come to bring him hame, he was delving in his yearday, shooking kale and laying leeks, but the hose and but the breeks, and up his beggar duds he clicks, this wee bit German lairdy. And he's clapped in an Ergetman's chair, this wee bit German lairdy. He's put forth the foreign trash and dibbled them in her yardie. He's pruned the rose o' English plumes and broken the harp o' Irish loons. The thistle taps all jagged stooms, this wee bit German lairdy.
Charles Edward Stuart, born in Rome, was the grandson of the former King James II, who was deposed from the English throne during the Glorious Revolution. Charles had been raised by his father James III, who also led a failed invasion in 1715, now living in Rome in an exiled Stuart court. Though the small Italian states formally supported Charles Edward Stuart's claim, this amounted to very little as far as taking the English crown was concerned. And after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, this ended French recognitions of Stuart claims to the English throne. But in January 1744, Louis XV invited the exiled king to Paris during the middle of the War of Austrian Succession. This, of course, was the first time they had gone back to war since the War of Spanish Succession. Encouraged by a French victory in May 1745 at the Battle of Fontenoy, Charles and his party set sail on the 5th of July for Scotland. During the voyage north, Charles's squadron were fired upon by the HMS Lion and the Celtic Sea, two British warships. But despite this, Charles and his fleet successfully landed him at Erksay on July 23, 1745. Though he was never able to get formal support from King Louis XV, he gained crucial support of Donald Cameron of Lochiel after Charles provided security for the full value of his estate should the rising prove abortive. The Stuarts found support for their cause among the Scottish Highlanders. Scotland had mostly supported the Stuart claims because of their opposition to the Union, formed in 1707. Though the Union established closer relations between Scotland and England, this had negative effects on the Scottish trading class, now having to compete with the English, which they were unable to do, of course. These effects, of course, caused inflation among the Scottish economy. The Stuarts, for their part, had promised to end this union and restore Scotland to the way it had been before 1707. Charles raised his standard at Glenfinnan on August 19, 1745. This, of course, is what partially prompted King George II to make peace with Frederick and end British participation in the War of Austrian Succession. In the Western Highlands was the base of the rebellion, and the more Jacobite sympathetic group of the Scottish nobles and burghers. Another reason for the timing of the Jacobite rebellion was the opposition's criticism of King George's defense of Hanover in Europe. Rivals of the Hanoverians charged that George had put the Hanoverian electorate above the British Empire. Charles moved into Perth and continued to be able to recruit Scottish Highlanders who were sympathetic to his cause. Able to recruit influential Scottish nobles such as Lord George Murray, James Drummond, the Duke of Perth, John George of Glenbucket, and many more. King George had hoped the forces led by John Cope would be able to quash the rebellion in its infancy. But Cope was forced to divert his troops to Inverness, and this cleared a path to Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, which was seized by the Jacobites in the middle of September. On September 17th, the day Charles Stuart made his glorious triumph through the city of Edinburgh, Cope and his army lay just 25 miles away. Cope had reached the village of Preston with around 2,500 men. The young prince began to plan a march south to meet the Union troops. After staying 2 nights at King's Park, the prince and his Jacobite army moved south to Duddington. where they were giving the news that Cope and his army had moved south to meet them. John O'Sullivan, a Jacobite officer, wrote of the prince's reaction. His Royal Highness lost no time, got the pipes to play immediately, and set his little army in order of battle. You cannot imagine what courage the prince's activity in setting every regiment in order, the joy that he had painted in his face, and saying some words in Gaelic to inspire his men. At 4 a.m. on the morning of September 21st, the Jacobite army was ordered to move off in silence while it was still dark. Not until first light did Cope's men warn him that the Jacobite army now lay just 800 yards away from their position. Cope now positioned his left flank to wheel around and meet the direction of the Jacobite attack, but his disorganized troops were unable to meet the attack and got outflanked by the Jacobite army on the left side. The Highlander troops were able to drive back the center of the Hanoverian dragoons. A dangerous gap, though, soon emerged in the Jacobite center, though Cope was unable to take advantage of this mistake, and it was quickly plugged by the Duke of Perth and his men. The Highlanders fought with a ferocity and passion which the Union troops were unprepared for. Cope's infantrymen broke under the onslaught of Jacobite pressure, and the battle quickly became a rout. The Highlanders suffered only around 20 dead, whereas the Union troops suffered around 400 dead, 500 wounded, and around 15,000 of Cope's men were taken prisoner. Cope himself was able to escape west to Berwick the next day. But the battle was clearly a Jacobite victory. The Jacobite prince wrote to his exiled father, then returned to an excited crowd at Edinburgh the next day. The mood amongst the Scottish rebels was one of jubilation and victory. The King George now sent a force under the command of Field Marshal George Wade to intercept the Scottish rebels. But the Jacobites were able to evade the force and now took the city of Carlisle. Back in London, the king celebrated his birthday on November 9th in his traditional lavish style. Despite the loss at Prestonpan, loyalist sentiment appeared to be growing among those living in London. Thomas Arne's new song, God Save Our Noble King, was being sung around England. And of course, this was to become the national anthem, and still is. In January, a second force was sent under the young Cumberland, who advanced north. In the meantime, the Jacobites now took Manchester and Preston. A quick feint by Lord George Murray, one of the Jacobite officers, duped the young Cumberland and made him believe that he was attempting to link up with Jacobite forces in the south of Wales. This now left a path open to London. But the young commander quickly corrected his mistake and was able to close the gap before any significant forces were able to move towards the capital. The key to the Jacobite ambitions was the hope that once troops began to move through England with a significant force, that Englishmen would rise up and rally around them. But nothing of the sort happened, and the Jacobite rebellion remained a mostly Scottish endeavor. Charles Edward Stuart also depended on foreign aid from the French. The Jacobites were eventually able to make it to Derby, but this was likely for political reasons, hoping to provoke a French invasion to attack London from the south. This way they could create a double attack on London. But this attack never came, and the Jacobite forces eventually were forced to retreat back north to Scotland. And they were now being pursued by a force of Union troops under Cumberland. Cumberland established his winter headquarters at Aberdeen and waited for the weather to improve to decide on how he was going to deal the final blow to the rebels. As spring came, Cumberland moved, hoping to deal a final blow to the rebels. On April 4th, he captured the city of Inverness. In the Jacobite camp, the situation was becoming ever more desperate. A French ship carrying goods was intercepted by the British Navy. Prince Charles Edward and his men decided that an attack was to be had on the next day. Considering the 15th was Cumberland's birthday, the Jacobites hoped to catch the Cumberland. Considering the 15th was Cumberland's birthday, the Jacobites hoped that Cumberland's camp would be full of drunkards and would be unable to mount a defense. In the early hours of 2 a.m., the Jacobites planned to make a surprise attack in the pitch-black dark on Cumberland's camp, hoping to catch them by surprise. But their supply lines were stretched way too far, and the sneak attack was unable to be launched. At 8 a.m., the Jacobites realized that Cumberland's troops were now but 4 miles away. The Jacobites quickly got into formation, but proved very disorganized. As the battle began in the early afternoon, Cumberland's artillery and firepower began to prove devastating for the Jacobite cause. The Jacobite army discipline began to disintegrate, and the right flank attacked without orders, following the left flank's example. The Highlanders' charge in the center, which had proved so successful at Prestonpan, looked to be flailing in front of the enemy, who used an unprecedented defense mechanism. Between 1,000 and 15,000 of Prince Charles Edward's men were killed. Many were wounded. Cumberland had drawn attention to the enemy orders to capture prior to the battle, which suggested that the Highlanders did not intend on taking prisoners. The Stuart king escaped the battlefield, but the loss at Culloden would end the Stuart cause for good. Cumberland's men rushed throughout the Highlands, burning homes and driving off cattle. The British government was determined to destroy the Highland way of life. King George eventually forbade the wearing of Highland dress and the carrying of weapons, passing laws against the clan system. This put an end to the Jacobite cause for good. During 1746, the French continued their advance into the Austrian Netherlands, taking Antwerp and then clearing the Dutch and Austrian forces from the area between Brussels and Mezous. After defeating the Jacobite rebellion at Culloden, the British launched a diversionary raid on Laurent in an unsuccessful attempt to divert French forces, while the new Austrian commander, Prince Charles of Lorraine, was defeated by Saxe at the Battle of Roux in October. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was negotiated largely between Britain and France, with the other powers following their lead, ending the War of Austrian Succession. The treaty was marked by mutual restitution of conquest, including the fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia to France, Madras and India to England, and the barrier towns to the Dutch. The treaty also established the rights of the Habsburg heiress Maria Theresa to all the Austrian lands. But the Habsburgs were still seriously weakened by the guarantee to Prussia and its conquest of Silesia. But the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle would formally end the War of Austrian Succession.